G'day. Australia, home of koala bears, Vegemite, and the Wiggles. New Zealand, home of Lord. But there's something else that these two places are known for, and that is what I'm here to talk about today. And of my own accord, not for a grade, not for a class, and there's definitely not someone with a gun behind this camera telling me to talk about Australia and New Zealand in a positive light. It's okay. There's not. But regardless of that, Australia and New Zealand are also home to the famous film movement called the Australian and New Zealand New Wave. So what exactly does that mean? What is that? After World War II, the Australian and New Zealand film industries were basically on life support, and then by the 1960s, they were nearing death. That all changed, however, in 1968 when Australia's government increased the funding for the arts. This includes film, and thus we have the Australian Film Development Corporation and the National Film and Television Training School, which basically kick-started the Australian New Wave, which lasted from 1970 to around 1985. New Zealand did somewhat of a similar thing, but they took longer than Australia. Their government, during the Muldoon government, which lasted from about 1975 to 1984, established the Interim Film Commission, and in 1978, the New Zealand Film Commission. And these were developed with the Australian models in mind. And with these new developments in the arts also came government funds and tax loopholes for artists, especially in New Zealand, which led to a stark rise in films produced in both countries. So thanks to governmental intervention in the film industry, we also get the New Zealand New Wave, which lasts from 1977 to 1986. And now filmmakers in both countries have the means and money to produce films, as well as a motive, which is the tax loopholes. So what were these films like? Well, in Australia, these films were mainly atypical in genre. They often combined multiple genres in one film. Like, for example, Picnic at Hanging Rock by Peter Weir could be called a supernatural drama period piece. At the end of the day, for Australia New Wave films, it was the expression of the story that was more important, at least in the early years, and less important was the strict adherence to a genre. And these stories, at least for Australia, included many tropes and patterns that were common from one film to the next, which obviously makes sense given it's a new wave that has commonalities. For example, the seemingly endless, powerful wilderness was often used as the landscape for most Australian films. This made it common for films to include conflict between domesticated life in the city and the wild natural world of the outback. Sometimes, in addition to the wilderness, the indigenous people of Australia, the Aboriginals, were included in the narratives to serve a similar purpose of domestication versus wild, something that Peter Weir also used in his other film, The Last Wave. New Zealand's films of the New Wave were also similar in the geographical aspect. They used the geographical representation of its country with the sprawling wilderness and coasts as the landscape for many of its films. One that comes to the top of my head is Jane Campion's The Piano. Lots of forests, water, hills. However, there was a distinct difference between New Zealand's New Wave and Australia's. And that difference is that most films of the New Zealand New Wave were countercultural and full of testosterone and action, male characters, violence, heterosexual male relationships. In a way, that kind of makes sense why New Zealand's new wave was full of that, and that's due to Australia's new wave that was going on during New Zealand's new wave. Because Australia's new wave started before New Zealand's, they were in a stage of Ozploitation films, and that's a term coined by Quentin Tarantino, of all people, and it describes the Australian film industry's exploitation of the Western view of Australia for the purpose of making profit in America. And this became more and more frequent as the Australian New Wave reached the 80s. So these Ozploitation films included raunchy comedies, bike films, horror movies, set genre films. So we can see early 80s and late 70s Ozploitation is going on in Australia, while New Zealand's new wave is beginning to take place in New Zealand. So they're pretty much looking at what Australia is doing and doing the same. So New Zealand's new wave films mostly contained manly man films. Goodbye Pork Pie, Carry Me Back, Shaker Run. Those are all notable examples that came from the movement. However, later in the movement, this male domination began to change. It was challenged by New Zealand's women filmmakers. Melanie Reid was the first woman to direct a fictional feature in New Zealand. It was called Trial Run and released in 1984. And Gayleen Preston released Mr. Wrong in 1985. Both films are psychological thrillers that represent the idea of the Kiwi Gothic. That means that isolation and despair in these films are heavy, and personal space of the characters is often threatened by forces that prevent settlement. So that's pretty similar to the early Australian New Wave, as in these forces that were preventing settlement often took the role as landscape, made the landscape seem alive in a supernatural way that prevented people from settling. So now you have a bit of an idea of what the Australian and New Zealand New Wave looked like. But in order to truly give my idea on the Australian and New Zealand New Wave, you need to understand the history that was going on in Australia and New Zealand during the 70s. Much like America, Australia was going through a period of unrest. In the late 60s to mid 70s, most citizens were angry with the treatment of women, Aboriginals, the environment, as well as the White Australia policy. And then obviously citizens were against the country's involvement in the Vietnam War, conscription, etc. And then this civil unrest, particularly regarding to conscription, led to the 1972 rise of the Whitlam government. Under this government, more social welfare programs were put into place, and Australia pulled out of the Vietnam War. Aboriginal people's land rights were given more support. So things kind of got better due to civil unrest and people wanting to make a change. In New Zealand, something similar happened. Citizens were also protesting their country's involvement in the Vietnam War. They also protested French nuclear testing that was occurring in the Pacific Ocean. And people were fighting for the land rights of the Maori, who are the indigenous people of New Zealand. People were also fighting for women's rights and gay rights. Another thing, New Zealand was going through a period of rapid inflation due to the global energy crisis in 1973, as well as their loss of Britain as an export market. So with the history of Australia and New Zealand, as well as the history of the trends of the Australian and New Zealand New Wave, I believe now that it's safe to say that the films of this new wave were a form of activism in itself, especially regarding decolonization of Australia and New Zealand. We can see this decolonization take place in the Australian New Wave through the inclusion and treatment of the Australian wilderness as well as the Aboriginal people. As I mentioned before, the endless, powerful wilderness as a landscape was often used to create conflict between domesticated life in the city and the wild, natural world of the outback. This conflict then gave the environment in these films a chance to fight back against the people who were hurting it in real life. The white men, the colonizers of Australia, who came to the land hundreds of years ago and changed it forever. In many of these films, the land reclaims itself from the colonist protagonists, often in supernatural ways that highlight the spiritual, otherworldly power of the land. And similarly, the inclusion of Aboriginal characters and culture also ties into the powerful land, making not only the land of Australia reclaim itself from the white men in these movies, but also the native inhabitants somewhat get justice. In no films is this idea more clear than in Peter Weir's Picnic at Hanging Rock, which was released in 1975 in Australia. A little bit about Peter Weir. He was born and raised in Australia, worked within the TV industry in the 60s before turning to film. He's most known for his films Dead Poets Society and The Truman Show. However, his new wave films are also of great acclaim. This is where Picnic at Hanging Rock and his other film, The Last Wave, come in. So Picnic at Hanging Rock is a film adapted by Joan Lindsay's 1967 novel of the same name, and it follows the disappearance of 3 teenage girls and their teacher while their whole class is out on a Valentine's Day picnic in the Australian wilderness. These students and teacher are of high class and prestige. They're from money, they are white, and many of them are immigrants from other white countries. And with the action of taking this trip from their prep school to the vast wilderness, we can see a mini colonization unfold. These white rich people are trampling over the natural land that has been there for thousands of years. But in the film, this land, this natural land, as we will see, has its own revenge. It makes some of these colonizers disappear and causes the whole class of girls to panic. It ruins the lives of these girls, much like how the colonizers ruined the lives of the Aboriginals and changed much of the land on Australia. The film uses wind instruments and melancholy piano, as well as wind sounds and upward angle shots of the rocks surrounding the wilderness to give the viewer a feeling of supernatural dread.
Irma! Look at them! Where in the world are they going? Without their shoes! Irma, wait! Wait for me! Please wait! Wait, Irma, wait! Everything begins and ends at exactly the right time and place. Look.
I found myself dreading what would happen next when I heard the music and saw just the juxtaposition of the shots of the huge rock and the girl. You, as the viewer, already know the rock has something to do with the demise of the girls from the beginning, but you don't know how, because obviously the rock doesn't talk, but Peter Weir makes the Rock more of a character, like a ghost almost. He gives the environment that supernatural power that is so common in Australian New Wave films, and with that power, it overcomes the colonists. A similar thing is done in his film The Last Wave, in which a white lawyer from the city must represent a group of Aboriginal men who have been accused of murder. Like Hanging Rock, this film also uses music and foreboding shots to its advantage, giving the viewer a sense of supernatural unease when it comes to both nature and Aboriginal people. For example, there's a scene where the lawyer is sleeping and he wakes up and he sees the Aboriginal man in his room. So we get a sense of these people are not what society sees them as today. They are much more powerful. They can walk through dreams.
Jesus.
And basically, there's this feeling of irony because Aboriginal characters in the film are supposed to be the ones who are supposed to feel powerless because they're being charged with murder, but they're the ones who are the most powerful because they know what's going on with the environment and with the supernatural occurrences in the film. And that environment, it has power too, just like the Aboriginal people. And this power mostly comes in the form of water. It's almost constantly raining in The Last Wave. Floods occur inside homes and inside cars, and water is also involved in shots of the beach, and there's just huge waves ready to destroy the lawyer by the end of the film. And water in this film is essentially purging the colonizers from the land and returning it to the rightful hands of nature, Australia, and the Aboriginals. However, Peter Weir is not the only filmmaker of the movement that aided in this artistic decolonization. Jane Campion was a major filmmaker, is still a major filmmaker, but she was a major filmmaker in the New Zealand New Wave as well. Campion was born and raised in New Zealand, and she grew up in the theater community. She enrolled in art school in London after graduating with a degree in anthropology, but she wasn't satisfied with this art degree. She wasn't satisfied with painting, so she turned to film and made multiple short films before her first feature, which is Sweetie. Although her films were made after the New Zealand New Wave ended, they still echo the same sentiments of the Australian and New Zealand New Wave and echoes the decolonial properties that I believe are present in the Australian and New Zealand New Wave, especially with its treatment of women. Sweetie, her first feature, was released in 1989, and much like Peter Weir's work, it involved the conflict between wild and domestic, though much of this conflict takes the place of people rather than land. Kay, a factory worker, is living domestically with her boyfriend Louie until her sister Dawn, or Sweetie, moves into her home and makes her life miserable. Sweetie has multiple mental health issues, and her behavior is just erratic and often violent, especially when she doesn't get her way. However, this conflict between wild and domestic is not the only reason why I see Sweetie as artistic decolonization. I also see it as that because it involves women being portrayed in a way that has not occurred in the Australian and New Zealand New Waves, especially in the New Zealand New Waves, which saw women more as sexual objects or love interests But Sweetie saw women more as protagonists, and women had flaws, but they were real people, and they were bad people. Kay was not a good person. She hated her sister, even though her sister was suffering. Their mom was not a good person. She allowed her family to get overrun by this issue of Sweetie. And Sweetie was just crazy. She put a lot of people in danger. But because they weren't represented as these sexual objects or just as the plain love interest for the male character is what makes this film so unique and classifies it as decolonization. As for Campion's other film, I saw The Piano, which was released in 1994, and this also takes another feminist shot at decolonization, although it's more on the nose, as the film is literally about a Scottish mother and her daughter moving to New Zealand to live on a plantation with a plantation owner in the 1800s. In this film, we see how poorly the Maori people were treated by colonizers, and we see how violent and ruthless the white colonizers were, even between themselves, even between white people. The mother in the film, Ada, was sexually harassed and assaulted by one man and abused by her husband. She's treated as an object and like property rather than a human being, and that was pretty similar to how most women were treated during that time. The history of New Zealand is stripped from whitewashing. It shows how horrible the white colonists could be. It didn't show them as these good people. It showed them as flawed, not great people, people who shouldn't probably be in power over the Maori. And it basically decolonizes history. It gives a more accurate representation of New Zealand's colonizers. So there you have it, Australia and New Zealand's New Wave, how it worked to change the perspective of Australian culture and New Zealand culture before the Ozploitation movement took over and catered to the desires of the West. You know, like Crocodile Dundee, the only Australian film ever. So thank you for watching. Please don't fail me. Goodbye.